All right, it's that moment that you've been waiting for. It's time to shift the curves. So students get really excited about shifting supply and demand curves, and they just do it all the time, even though you really don't have to. So there are times when you want to shift a curve, times when you don't. And what we've seen so far is that supply and demand curves are really powerful, even without moving them. With say a demand curve, again, it's the relationship between the quantity and the price, and our demand curve shows that relationship graphically. So what we can do here is say that this represents everything as it is, but suppose that we change something. And as economists, we only change one thing at a time, which is called ceteris paribus. It's holding everything else equal. So we don't want to deal with the complications of reality where lots of things are continuously changing, because then we make really bad guesses. Here we're doing micro, where we can hold everything constant. So let's say that something changes that would affect how much people are willing and able to pay for a good. So we're going to call these determinants. So determinants of demand. So in this case, let's think about what may shift our demand curve. One of the go-tos is preferences. You could call it tastes and preferences. So here it could be that this is currently the market for quinoa, however it's spelled. So it's quinoa, and at a price of $6, currently 15 bags are being sold every week. Well, what if something comes out in the news and they say, hey, quinoa is so good for you, it'll make you live like 50 years longer, and you can also eat chocolate and still be healthy. And so that might actually increase the demand. So let's look at what happens there. If people now have a sudden increased desire or willingness or ability to buy the good, that's going to shift our demand curve like this. I like to do 2 arrows and then do D prime. So that shows that this is the new demand curve. We show that it's going from here to there. And notice what that says. It says that at the same price of 6, we now have a larger quantity demanded, say 20. So that is a change in taste and preferences that shifts to the right. Same thing could happen shifting it to the left, right? It might move over here. And at this point, we might drop down to, say, 5. That could happen if we find out that quinoa has been infected with Ebola. Then suddenly people wouldn't want to buy it anymore. So as a business, you really care what is out in the news if it's a good that you produce. So that's taste and preferences. Another thing that can happen is a change in income. So with income, we can have what's called a normal good. So a normal good, if I have more money, I'll buy more of it. So for example, organic quinoa, maybe that's something that I buy more of if I have more money. So this would be an increase in income would increase our demand. What about an inferior good? An inferior good doesn't necessarily mean bad. It just means that it's sort of the lower quality of the comparison good. So for example, conventional quinoa as opposed to organic, if I were a student and didn't have much money, I might buy not organic quinoa. I might switch to some other good. So that would mean that if I had more money, my demand curve would actually shift to the left. That'd be a decrease. We tend not to say up and down. We like to say left and right, or increase and decrease. So with an inferior good, if you have more money, you buy less of it. If you have less money, you buy more of it. So I eat a lot of mac and cheese. It's not very expensive. If I had a lot more money, maybe I'd be eating steak every day. But if I don't have a lot of money, I'm going to buy something that tends to be lower price, or at least compared to the other thing. Cars are really expensive. I drive a Hyundai. It's still expensive, but it's a lot less than a Lexus. So an inferior good doesn't necessarily mean bad. It doesn't mean inexpensive, but it tends to be less expensive than what it's compared to. So here we have preferences, income, both normal and inferior. We also have prices, and this is prices of other goods. We've seen what happens when the price of this good changes. We just move the price up and down, and that moves us along a demand curve. But the price of another good can also affect us. So we could have a complement. So with a complement, let's think about what happens. Say quinoa and salmon. So maybe I really enjoy making a dish of quinoa and salmon, and so I tend to use these things together, right? Peanut butter and jam is another example. Chocolate chips and basically anything. So what can happen is, say that the price of salmon changes. Perhaps the price of salmon decreases. The next step that I like to make is what happens to the quantity of salmon. This implies that the quantity of salmon that we purchase increases. So people are now buying more salmon. If people eat their salmon and their quinoa together, they're also going to eat more quinoa. So here the demand for quinoa would increase. The reverse would be true if the price of salmon increased. Suddenly salmon's really expensive, and so that would be an increase in the price, a decrease in the quantity of salmon purchased, and if I'm not buying salmon that I always eat with my quinoa, I might eat a lot less quinoa. That would shift my demand to the left. It'd be a decrease in demand. We then have substitutes. So let's go ahead and replace this with something else. So quinoa and rice. Say the price of rice decreases. Well, oftentimes if I'm going to make a dish, I can sort of choose between rice and quinoa. They're not the same thing, but they're similar. They're substitutes for each other. The price of rice decreases. That means that the quantity of rice will increase. So if I'm buying more rice, that means I'm going to buy less quinoa. That's going to decrease my demand shift to the left. On the other hand, if rice is suddenly more expensive, I'm going to buy less of it and more quinoa. It's going to be an increase in demand. So here we have a few of the things that determine our taste and preference, our demand curve. We could also have expected future prices, including the future price of this good. So if I expect the price of this good to increase in the future, I hear about a quinoa shortage on the news. Maybe a place that makes a lot of quinoa was hit with a hurricane, and so the whole next season is lost. I might stock up on it now. So that means that I might buy more now, even though everything else is constant, but my expectations about the future have changed. So this isn't everything, and oftentimes you can argue a lot of other things, but it's important to focus on one thing at a time. Think about it, is going to increase the amount that you'd purchase at that price or decrease the amount that you'd purchase at that price.